Well, Steffi, thank you. This is an amazing conference. Yes, the name of this panel is Tech History, Outlook, and Future. That's a big topic. So, to me, the way to whack at this is, what does history teach us about how to manage tech revolutions? What did we learn from the internet boom? And how can we apply those lessons more effectively to the revolutions before us in AI, in genetic engineering, in biology, in batteries, sustainability, and everything else that lies before us? Also, what are some guardrails or economic incentives we can create so that we're perhaps less surprised when technology booms and there's good and then sometimes there's not so good? As Steffi told you, two of our panelists, Mitchell and Esther, have been part of this revolution for, gosh, from its earliest days. And our third, Mona, is a true digital native. So we'll be able to whack at this topic from a bunch of different perspectives. So maybe I should start with Mitchell. Is it okay if I start with you? What does history teach us about how to manage all this?
I'll start with two things. They're a little bit different. One is that we typically exhibit a frequency bias, or a newest, biggest, better bias, or the newest thing is the most exciting, or the biggest thing, or the biggest change, or the most important. And it's good to have that excitement, but that's not always the case. So it's easy to forget what it was like not to have a global network. So the new thing, AI is the biggest new thing, or bio whatever is the biggest new thing, and there hasn't been anything as important or as much change as we've seen so quickly. Well, maybe, but it's really easy to forget that's because we have a network. And the network, a global network, we call it the internet, where the number of times you pick up your phone each day, you have to imagine none of that. And so with new technologies, I think it's most pronounced in AI today, but you see it across a slightly broader spectrum. They're not always as big and as different and as flashy and the most newest thing humanity's ever seen. So that's point one. And point two is that the bigger the change that's possible, the less we'll understand it. And the less we're even able to conceive of what would happen. Right? If you live in the 1400s and you don't go more than 5 or 10 miles in your lifetime from where you're born, today's travel and space travel and so on, it's just not a world that you would imagine, or the way we commute, or the different opportunities that are available because time and distance has fundamentally changed in the human experience. And just like the serf in the 1400s can't imagine our lives, we cannot imagine what life will be like in, say, 300 years. We really can't. It's going to change, questions of identity, democracy is going to change. All of these things are going to look very different. What does ownership look like? Who knows, right, with digital assets? And so we do have sometimes this view that we are going to understand it, and usually it's more like trying to go into the past. So there is something very science fiction-y about the exponential changes or the kinds of changes that we're living through. I'm a science fiction. I love science fiction, but that's another way of saying that we just really cannot imagine where these technologies are going to take the human experience.
Mona,
maybe
you were born with a I don't want to say an iPhone in your crib, but you are part of a generation that takes a lot of the stuff that we grew up with, that takes a lot of the stuff of the internet revolution for granted. And that's actually a good thing. how can we think about this in a new way?
Well, first of all, I'm not that young, I would say. I come from a very big family, so we're 10, and I'm the second oldest, and the youngest is actually 9, my little brother. So just observing his behavior and what he does is super fascinating. At times, I even play with Roblox with him, just to understand a bit like what he's doing and how does he think about things. So I'm not that young, I would say. But with the internet boom sort of taught us, again, if we look at the past, is that the access actually is in the endpoint, but actually the beginning. So if you look at it, the past 15 years, and you were talking about the iPhone 4, we started to get access in our fingertips. But I would say now, looking at today, it has sort of become overwhelming. So we have a lot of access, but I would say especially for the younger generation, it does feel overwhelming. It's like, okay, where do I go to? There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of different platforms. If I'm looking for something or I want to keep up to date, do I go to different For You pages? And every single platform itself, it's super overwhelming, how the algorithms work, especially that we don't really have much control around it. So I would definitely say, I agree with Mitchell, we can't really predict how the next 10 to 20 years look like, but what we can do, especially me being an early stage founder, is really looking at a problem and then just like innovating around it. So how we imagine it is that if access has become overwhelming, especially now that we have new tools available like AI, could we sort of utilize technology to help us to bring relevance out of the clutter? So could it actually be more so of a helping hand, how we call it, where, it knows Mona, it knows Mona's context, and it can go out there and maybe build our own discoveries. Like the platform Arca that we are building, it's a lot about when you go in the morning to the platform, it's like, hey, Mona, these are the most relevant or interesting things that is happening in the space travels industry or wherever, and it can pick up things from Substack or things from different sources, instead of us navigating the fragmented spaces. So we're building like an application layer, but it was very interesting. We had lunch with Fred and Mitchell, and we were talking about the early days of the internet, and there was this word, portability, that came up. So I think for us to have better experiences, and and especially if we want the next decade to be, from access to actually like AI helping us to find the most relevant things or whatever the technology will be, it does also mean that the companies should be more open to opening their accesses instead of it closing down. So it is also something that companies and founders that are building in this space that I encourage, especially in the internet space, is that let's just keep things open. Super excited, by the way, that the LLM models, there's a lot of open source models that can be utilized. So I love the idea of openness, I would say. I'm super excited to build, upon that.
I want to get back to that in a little bit. Esther.
Okay, so just a kind of disclosure at the beginning. I flew in from California overnight. I had 3 hours of sleep. So I'm going to hallucinate a bit for you. And the thing about hallucinations is mostly they're rubbish, but one of the greatest hallucinations in the history of mankind, or humankind, was that the Earth was round. And it actually turned out to be true, but a lot of people were executed for spreading that rumor. And so one of the challenges with LLMs is they're very glib, and they make these wonderful metaphors. They kind of gather the best speech and make it elegant, but they often don't understand the underlying models. At the same time, again, sometimes they hallucinate really interesting things. And I feel a bit like an LLM here. I'm not my parents were scientists, I'm not. But one of the biggest forces on Earth was evolution and the creation of life. And life started with metabolism, not with sentience, not with brains. And amazing things happened because that metabolism kept doing amazing new things, and the things that were good were saved by a fitness landscape that ultimately turned us into thinking human beings. And that was sort of a metabolism of food and nutrients. Now what we're seeing, what does an AI really want most? Electricity and data clouds. And if you look at the new fitness landscape, in some sense, the food we ate changed us and turned us into predators and so forth. And Michael Pollan talks about corn having kind of seduced us into growing more corn so that the corn could multiply. And now if an AI were wanting to multiply or even just perpetuate its own existence, it would make us make more data clouds and produce more electricity, and it sounds kind of familiar. So the question is, where are we now being manipulated by a new fitness landscape that's basically, and not with sentience. It's not one rogue AI goes out and does this. It's sort of the AI as a population.
So it sounds like you're worried that the capitalist economy is going to drive us forward into making a lot of the same mistakes.
Yes. And I mean, making the same mistakes is almost too trivial. I mean, the point is really understanding that it's like an anthill, but, I mean, sentience may well emerge in some way that's not in individual objects, the way it is with us. And so, but I do have a solution, and then
I was going to ask.
Yeah, the guardrail is, don't fuss as much about training our AIs, train our babies. We need people to be aware. Okay. I mean, sitting here, we need people to be aware of their own motivations and how they can be manipulated, and then understand how to manipulate themselves. And, maybe we should all die. That would end all unhappiness and all evil. But as long as we're alive, I'm kind of human chauvinist, and the thing that drives us when we're not driven by a manipulating metabolism is the need for love and understanding in other humans. And we need to treasure that. And
without question. Mona, is there a generational issue here? Are there some things that your generation understands intuitively that approach the kinds of places that Esther is hoping we can kind of get to?
I don't know.
I remember one of the things, I was in a cab somewhere, I was in Australia, and the cab driver talked about getting spammed by some sort of, having his information sort of easily abducted and turned into some kind of wild, crazy artificial intelligence video about him, porn video with him. And what he said was, I actually wasn't worried about my friends because they all understand how to think about information on the internet. I was just worried about my parents and my grandparents. And so that made me wonder if we're already on the way. Can you help us understand sort of how you sort of look at things a little bit differently?
I would definitely say like every generation is very different. Like when I was little, my mom was much wiser than I am, and she was warning us about the dangers of the internet, and we couldn't like understand that when we had the computers, and mom's like, don't do this or think about this like this. And of course it has changed. Now we're the ones that talk to our mom. My mom actually was traveling a few months ago, and she sent us on WhatsApp a video where she said, oh my God, like, I don't know what's happening, but Russia just attacked Finland. Like, are you guys okay? And we're like, Mom, we're really, really great here, and there's no attack. And she sent us a video. And she's like, no. There's something happening out there. Like, open the balconies and look outside. And we're like, no, there's nothing. And we have this WhatsApp group where even my little brother, 9-year-old, is there. And we're all saying, like, there's nothing happening. So, yeah, of course, it's very different when our generation is explaining to Mom, actually, there's misinformation and there's disinformation. And I don't think she still really understands, like, the difference, right? So, yeah, I guess, like, there's some things that our generation might understand a bit better. And then, of course, like, you know, being, again, I'm not that young. So what we can do is that either we are just talking about the problems or we can actually take action. So I'm not a politician. I'm actually an entrepreneur. And the road that we took is, okay, let's build solutions to the problem. So, for instance, we're super frustrated how these bigger, larger corporations are working where, you know, from open protocols, it has become more closed, and we really don't own our data, we don't own our platforms. We spend hours daily in those platforms. My little brother, he lives in his iPad, so it shouldn't be like that. So either, again, you're a politician, and it's important to be a politician, by the way, so nothing against politicians. I think it's important that everybody plays a role, but I think when you're super impatient, you then like build a solution around it. So I guess what we are super, or at least how I say that I'm one of the luckiest persons to be alive, because what a time to build, like what a time to really like, you know, take action, get your hands dirty, and be like, okay, we have this super big problem, let's build a solution around it. So that actually also means that when you build your sort of own solution, what you get to do as a founder is that you get to bring the best people together. That's the first thing. I'm not the smartest person in the room. Actually, I love being the dumbest in the room and being surrounded with people that are much wiser and much smarter. That's number one. And number two is that there's no rules. So you really can you can invent, like you just look at things, how you look at things, bring people together around a shared vision, and then you just do it. And sometimes it does mean that you're breaking some rules, but usually the greatest innovations has also came to life by, like, you know, breaking rules. But basically what I'm trying to say is that I think when you have a certain outlook, like our generation, we're super frustrated, you know, how things operate, especially in the information landscape, how we access information, access knowledge. So that means, you know, bringing a new solution to life and translating our frustration directly to a product instead of just talking about it.
Mitchell, can you think of like some things that we might do in the future to try to give ourselves a little bit more freedom to kind of push back against, maybe we sort of need to almost accept the fact that the capitalist world is going to do what it does naturally and build giant businesses that try to kind of make as much money as they can for themselves at the expense of their customers. And are there some things that maybe we can do to push back, some technologies that like might, or approaches that might help us in that way going forward?
Yes, there are a few things. I'm going to come to Mona's point first about open. So we learned a lot about open in software and in open source software and in the early days of the internet. This audience, some of you might remember, we called it the web in those days, and it was the free and open web. So we learned a bunch of things, like we learned that it's possible, we learned that it's not crazy, that open source is in the mainstream, that people will actually share their work. Like no one believed it. I did 1 million interviews, like why would anybody volunteer? Why would they contribute? If you've done something, why would you ever share it? How can somebody else use your work? Right, this is before Uber, before Lyft, before we ever shared anything, right? So we learned some things that are really important and really valuable. And we learned that open standards at that layer of the technical stack drives interoperability and thus some competition. So we learned a lot. We also learned some things that the open source movement and the open advocates didn't do, which was good integrated user experience up and down the stack. Like Facebook is the website for small businesses. That's because there's, the open movement never developed an easy way to make websites. It's Facebook, right? So we learned some things about failures. We learned that open source, the classic model of developers scratching your itch, will get you a long way. It got us operating systems, it got us browsers, it got us languages, it's got a million open education, open architecture, it got us a long way. But it didn't get us far enough into the integrated, productized human experience business side of things to kind of be a competition. So there's a piece of learning about that. There's some learning for governments. Like in the US, it's hard because nonprofit law is kind of crazy. In Europe, increasingly the various regulations, which we historically support, are tricky with open source. And so there's a learning piece about what does an open source ecosystem look like, and how do we build not just individual successful projects like Linux or Mozilla or Apache or Ruby, whatever, but how do you actually build an ecosystem that looks more like a unified whole to a customer there. And then, of course, on a really geeky, technical, lawyerly type, we've learned that our antitrust and competition law are, really from the 1800s, and need really radical updates because this price piece, like what a hack on consumer protection. Make your products free and the laws just don't apply. And that's what happened. That's what's happened on the consumer internet today, and it's, it's very slow. So there's a kind of a starting point, and I'll stop there.
Mona, you talked a little bit about portability. Can you expand a little bit?
Well, we talked during the launch, and I definitely asked that same question for Michelle, because I want to hear like the early days. But when we started sort of reimagining how access to knowledge and information happens, it's just started with like the fragmented space, like everything is super fragmented, and again, like access was developed and we got these platforms, but they're not really connected. And then portability comes from the aspect where, what about if these platforms would be more connected? Like for instance, the application layer that we're building, you can sign in and then you can just tell like, hey, I'm interested in space travel. Can the AI like help me find interesting things from different platforms? Well, the problem that comes is that, well, a lot of platforms don't have their APIs open. Actually, now through AI, they're even more threatened. Spotify also closed one of their API accesses where the comments just flooded, where people were like, I just built my own, interaction layer for a playlist, and now everything is gone. I can't access the thing that I built. So that is like how I'm sort of like imagining is that, is it really a threat that there's more access between, like that platforms have at least the API, or at least that you can control your own data. At least like if you want to build your own product, that you can sort of access what Facebook has learned about you for the past 20 years.
So for example, you're thinking that perhaps we should maybe have a conversation about the modern equivalent of number portability. So I don't know if all of you in the room remember this, but 30 years ago, when you got a mobile phone, at least in the United States, if you wanted to switch carriers, you needed to switch your phone number. And one of the most important top-down regulations that was imposed on the phone carriers, at least in the United States, was that once you get a telephone number, you can switch from carrier to carrier to carrier to carrier. And that completely revolutionized the way people think about their mobile phone service at a time when the mobile phone business was exploding. I sometimes wonder if we could do the same thing with our social graph. If all of us had one social graph, and we could take that social graph from social network to social network to social network, if there was some kind of protocol that we could build all that on, that might give us more power over what our future was going to look like, and maybe take away a little bit of the power that some of the social networks had. Because a lot of us, for example, have been listening to some of the stuff coming out of some of the social media billionaires over the course of the past few weeks. And the question is, and people have been very frustrated. But of course, if we all had our own social networks that we could take from place to place to place to place, it would be a little bit like the way the media ecosystem was 125 years ago or 100 years ago. We could just change newspapers or switch the channel. And so I'm wondering to what degree you all think that's possible.
I mean, that's a perfect example. You mentioned it actually in lunch, and you were like, probably, Mona, you don't remember it. It's true, I don't, because I just have experienced the latter. So if I want to change my number, then I get my number changed. But yeah, I mean, of course, I understand why some platforms keep it closed, misuse and things like that. So there has to be like a good framework, I would say, but yeah.
Last question, because I know we're running out of time. Esther, are there some technologies that are coming in the future that I think you're most excited about?
Well, yes, and I'll be really, really brief. It's counterfactuals with AI and not LLMs, but we are so much better at modeling what did happen, what could happen, what might happen, what didn't happen. And I think the most important thing we can do right now is model what would happen if we paid caregivers, human beings taking care of other human beings. And, okay, because the value they create is so long-term, and it's for society, it's not individual. So we need to create much better models of the impact of this paying people to take care of other people. And we're out of time, but.
Thank you all. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Steffi, for putting together a fabulous panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.